So the last market failure that we need to look at is externalities. And the name kind of tells you what you need to know, really, which is that there is something external going on. So hence the word externality. So external what? And what it means is external to the transaction. So what we're saying is that something is being ignored. That's what it boils down to. And as a result, because either what's going to be ignored is either a cost or a benefit is going to be ignored. What that means is that because supply and demand are no longer reflecting the full costs and the full benefits, we won't any longer automatically get an optimal allocation of resources. We won't get to the point where welfare is maximised. So what is an externality? Let's define it. An externality is a very simple idea. It's a cost or benefit that affects a third party. A third party is somebody outside of the transaction, so not the consumer and the producer, who are the first and second parties. So it's a cost or benefit that affects a third party that is ignored by the consumer and the producer. And because of that, what's going to happen is that the equilibrium output will be either too high or too low, relative to what would be socially desirable, because we're not taking all of the costs or benefits into account. So therefore, we can say that the equilibrium output will be too high or too low relative to the optimal output, the best output, the one that maximises welfare. So in other words, there is a misallocation of resources which will result in a welfare loss. So let's have a look at at how we might break this down. So what we're saying is that there can be external costs. Those are negative effects on third parties. So external costs, something that damages somebody outside of the transaction. And there are also external benefits. These benefit somebody outside of the transaction. But from an economic point of view, they're both equally undesirable. External costs and external benefits are both bad, because they mean that the market will ignore them and therefore won't work properly. And what we're saying is that external costs and external benefits, they can result either from production, which is when the good or service is made, or they can result from consumption, which is when the good or service is used. So we have four types of market failure within one. External costs and external benefits resulting from production and consumption. But external benefits from production are quite rare, and we don't tend to talk about those very much. They're sort of positive. It's kind of it's something like if I am GlaxoSmithKline, the pharmaceuticals company, then I invent cures for diseases because I want to make lots of money, but the external benefit is that people get better. So it could be that that's something like kind of pharmaceutical companies, something like that. But so we don't tend to look at that one in much detail. The three that I'm going to focus on are the other three. So there could be external costs from production. So when you make something, there are costs that you pay, which are the private costs, but there are further costs that affect the environment. And these are fairly obvious. We're thinking about things like pollution, stuff that leads to kind of climate change, all those sorts of things. The trouble is that left to its own devices, the firm will ignore those because they don't actually financially impact that firm. So what we're saying is that there is an external cost on top of the private cost. And as a result, because the firm ignores some of those costs, it'll make too many of these things. If costs were higher, it would have to increase the price and reduce output, but it doesn't pay them, therefore it makes too many. There can also be external costs from when the product is used. Yeah, so there's no particular side effects of making beer. But if people drink it, then they get in their cars, they kill people, they're sick on the streets and so on. So there are damages to third parties that you don't really think about, when you go and have a beer. All you're thinking about is, I'd like to chill, I'd like a beer, I want to watch the football or whatever. And as a result, you will tend to over-consume beer relative to what would be socially desirable. So external costs can result from when the product is made or when it's used, and it's worth being aware of that distinction. It's quite important. And finally, there can be external benefits from consumption. The classic example here is things like vaccinations. Assuming one day, or by the time you watch this, maybe there already is a cure for a vaccine for COVID-19. Assuming that one day somebody comes up with a vaccination, should I become vaccinated? Should I take it? Well, the answer is yes, but how will I make that decision? I'll think about the benefit to me. In other words, the reason I'm going to get vaccinated is I'm not going to get COVID-19, and that's a good thing. However, if I get vaccinated, it also means that I'm not going to give it to you. But the question is, how much do I care about that? And the answer is not very much. So, because I'm only going to take my private benefit into account, I'll tend to underconsume. I'll tend to consume too few of these things relative to what would be socially desirable. But I don't care because it's no big deal for me. So, things with external benefits, we're saying that in these cases, they will tend to be under-consumed or produced. So in a mixed economy, you would want the government to try and encourage their production. Whereas things with external costs tend to be over-consumed or over-produced in a free market. Therefore, you'd think the government would want to discourage the production of those things. So, what we now know then is that what we said is that ideally, so a market takes us, the marketplace will take us to where supply equals demand. And that supply is now based, we're going to call it, on the firm's private cost. The cost the firm actually pays. Demand is based on the firm's on the consumer's private benefit, the benefit to them personally. We have equilibrium there. If there are no externalities, if there are no external costs and benefits, then now that will maximise welfare. So in other words, if the marginal private cost is the true cost, if that equals the marginal social cost, and I'll define that in a minute, but basically the marginal social cost, is, that's all in, the marginal social cost is the true full cost. So if the marginal private cost equals the marginal social cost, and if the marginal private benefit equals the marginal social benefit, then the free market gives us an optimal allocation of resources and there's no market failure. But in reality, we're saying that they're not necessarily the case, because the marginal social cost is equal to the marginal private cost plus any externalities or minus any externalities. So the marginal social cost, the true cost, is the cost the firm pays plus or minus any external costs or benefits from production. So external costs, external benefits from production have to be added or subtracted from the marginal private cost to get the full true cost. And similarly, the marginal social benefit is equal to the benefit to me plus or minus any costs or benefits that I impose on you. So it's plus or minus the externalities from consumption So in other words, plus or minus any external costs or external benefits from using the product. So, given that a lot of things do have positive and negative side effects, that means that a free market, since it only takes into account our private costs and benefits, the free market will often give us either too much or too little, too few, of different types of goods. And therefore, in a mixed economy, you'd want the government to step in to correct that misallocation of resources, and that's what we'll look at in more detail next.